Absolutely. All right. So Kyle's been writing these great new articles with his news roundup every day. So we've got the first three we're going to be going over here, talking about U.S., Europe, and Russia relations. I've got some questions. So the first one, Kyle, you're talking about Turkey, excuse me, you're talking about Erdogan visiting Kiev and he sort of portrayed himself as, I'm in a unique position to help mediate, during this crisis. And what we actually saw was he turned it into a weapons sale. So let me ask you, what do you think is going on here? I mean, do you think, as we see now, of course, but we're seeing more and more arms sales going to Ukraine. We're seeing more troops being sent to border countries like Poland, Romania, Germany. I know. I think I saw the Germans just sent about hundreds more troops to Lithuania. What is the latest you're seeing in terms of the fractures within NATO?
Yeah, so Turkey plays an interesting role here because they are a NATO member state and have been threatened with sanctions for the U.S. for buying the Russian S-400 air defense system. Sophisticated, advanced military technology. They have been at odds with the NATO policy, very much so in Syria throughout the Syrian civil war. The Kurds that the U.S. bats and that are deemed as some kind of great forces, enlightened Muslims in the Levant are the ones that we bat, but are seen by Turkey as terrorists, and so this has created some real tensions. And then we now have, of course, Turkey, because of those tensions, even though at one point during the Syrian civil war they shot down a Russian jet, I think have moved a little bit closer to Russia. Turkey, though, has also, I think grander, maybe pan-Turkish ambitions. They meddle a lot in Central Asia. They, I think, largely were driving not only Turkey, but as far as an outside power, were probably, aside from the Azeris, the biggest driver between the conflict in, what was that, 2020 between Azerbaijan and Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh. And so, we've seen Erdogan sell drones to Azerbaijan, to Ethiopia, and also to Ukraine. And so in one way, this guy is just a big arms dealer, but in another way, he was saying like, hey, I do have a relationship with Putin. I have a relationship with Zelensky, who's the Ukrainian president, and maybe, I could work something out here. And so when I was talking about on the show, I was like, interesting. I don't really think Erdogan is the guy that's going to bring a resolution to this situation, but maybe if really it's just like a thawed issue or something like that, that there would be room here. But that's not what happened. When Erdogan visited, he confirmed a weapons sale and inked an agreement to allow Ukraine to manufacture armed Turkish, the Bakatar, I think, TB2 drones. These things are pretty big. They're like a scaled down version of a Reaper or Predator US drone. And so they've already been used in battle by Ukraine in the past, and ramping up more would of course be a pretty significant weapon sale, I think. Also important to note that Ukraine is working and developing its own homegrown missile program. I think I talked about this already on the show, but they are developing missiles that will have the range to hit Moscow, and also Neptune missiles aimed out at the sea. And so Erdogan's visit did not end up as the peace accord as he initially painted it out to be, and turned into more of a weapons sale. You also have, as you're mentioning, some divide. While the British government in particular is sending another 300 troops to Poland, but anyways, with the British troop deployment, you also see that they're, I think, one of the still more hawkish, other than the Americans, in all this, with the Ukrainians being actually a little less aggressive than those two, and looking to scale back rhetoric. So I think that's what I had in the first roundup that I want to talk about, Connor.
Well, I wanted to ask you though. with the you get into hear about the incident between Matt Lee and Ned Price over the claims about the false flag video where they would show casualties and fake corpses and this kind of thing, and frame Kiev for a genocide against ethnic Russians and all this sort of thing. Do you think, how much of this do you think is a reaction to, or at least trying to are we trying to distract from the revelations that came out in the Spanish press? Because I know you warned that the Hawks might see some things in there that that they don't like. So are there different factions trying to either distract attention from that, from the concessions that were made by America and NATO, or at least some of the things that were offered that maybe the Hawks don't want? Maybe arms control and things of that nature. What do you think is the angle here? Why is how do you explain the uptick in the information war? We are seeing things from the Post. I think in your second article you mentioned about how they're saying that there's going to be, the attack could come where you could see 50,000 casualties and 5 million people displaced, at 25,000 people in Ukraine's armed forces killed. Sullivan went out and boasted about how there could be an insurgency and how we could make this very, very strategically costly for the Russians. How do you explain this coming from the State Department, which should nominally, obviously, we expect that Blinken is working for Biden, at least when he's talking to Lavrov, and Biden and Putin have this understanding. But it seems like after this letter, after these revelations of the written responses to the Russian security proposals came out, and after, as we get further and further away from Biden talking with Putin directly, that things heat up again, and there's more and more bad cops and less good cops.
Yeah, so it's a phrase I've heard used somewhat frequently lately. Confession through projection, I think, is a little bit of what's going on here, Connor, where the U.S. is, making up these stories and making up these propaganda stories against Russia. But at the same time, the State Department is in a full-scale press claiming that it's Russian misinformation that's really harming the United States and distorting what's happening here, that the Americans, that the Ukrainians are just good people, and that Russia is the aggressive, belligerent neighbor, and Putin is the next Hitler or Stalin, that we have to worry about expanding his borders. And if you check out the State Department, Antony Blinken's Twitter handle right now, you will see for at least the past 2 or 3 weeks, they're putting out disinformation warnings and essentially condemning any rhetoric that is remotely opposed to furthering NATO expansion, so including Ukraine into NATO. There's plenty of reasons to oppose Ukraine becoming a NATO member state. Hell, Joe Biden doesn't think that Ukraine is going to become a NATO member state anytime soon because they don't meet the qualifications to become a NATO member state, right? And so is she really claiming that her own president is putting out Russian disinformation? Of course not. And so this is just all State Department propaganda that's constantly being levied here, and it's really problematic, I guess, Connor. At the same time, I find it kind of easy to ignore and just roll my eyes at, because it's all there's nothing new really, and anytime they have something new, it's like this, where it's just such a fake, made-up claim. Do you really think that if, let's say, they claim that there was a false flag in some village, that people who lived in that village wouldn't take out their cell phones, Connor, and go recording in the street saying, "Hey, where's the explosion that the Russians were talking about? There's no explosions here. Nobody died here." It's one thing to say that Russia would bomb a Ukrainian village and claim it was the Ukrainians. That kind of made sense. That's a false flag claim that works. But this one, this was just absurd. Now, you mentioned here that the second roundup that I have written an article for. And by the way, the great Will Porter is assisting with all these articles. And so very happy to have him helping. And they would not be as good as they are without Will. But a couple of the things you mentioned are, we not only have the propaganda from the U.S. government, what's coming out of the State Department, Jade Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, saying that the invasion could come any day. We have the Washington Washington Post reporting that, the invasion's going to come. Putin has 70% of the troops he needs for a maximum invasion. 50,000 civilians are going to be killed or injured, 25,000 military casualties, 5 million refugees. This is all because of the Russian invasion that's going to come again after the ground freezage, which is apparently going to be sometime in mid-February or late March, although I don't know if that's really has any strategic calculation for Putin here whatsoever. They also made the Olympics a big part of the claim. Again, I don't know if Putin really cares or would not invade Ukraine just because the Olympics were going on. In fact, I don't know, Connor, I don't think Putin would invade Ukraine because the Olympics were going on either, but I think maybe he would enjoy a little bit the irony of the situation in Ukraine reversing during the Olympic Games, which of course the U.S. famously pulled a coup in Ukraine while Olympic Games were being held in Russia in 2014, and that kicked off all the tensions that we're dealing with now 8 years later. So we do have this statement from Ukraine's foreign minister denouncing the American forecast as apocalyptic predictions, and Zelensky continuing to say that he doesn't think that there's an increase and that Americans are creating a crisis. I mean, maybe the Ukrainian government is downplaying this a little bit, Connor, but at the same time, the fact that you also have French President Emmanuel Macron on the day before he travels to Russia saying that the geopolitical objective of Russia today is clearly not Ukraine, but to clarify the rules of cohabitation with NATO and the EU, saying that they're, looking for talks, looking and not looking for an invasion. And then, of course, we had yesterday the meeting between Joe Biden and Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, along with the meeting between Macron and Putin. So between the Biden and the Scholz meeting, I think the most important thing, Connor, is, of course, that Biden said that the pipeline would be turned off, and Scholz said, well, we're in step with our American allies, but definitely stop short of saying that, yeah, we agree, we're going to sanction and shut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline if Russia invades.
Right. And I like how Macron is breaking the fourth wall by saying this isn't about Ukraine. This is about Russia essentially calling a moratorium on the status quo here with NATO expansion. And we're talking about, future cohabitation with the EU and with NATO. Now, Putin seemed pretty, as you indicate here, confident about, or I wouldn't say confident, but certainly it was a good reception after the talk with Macron. You quote him saying that, the Paris proposal could serve as, or Peskov said that, of course, this would require agreement from France's EU and NATO allies, first and foremost the U.S. And you say Putin said the Paris proposal could serve as a basis for a settlement to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And the quote, he will do everything to find compromises that suit everyone. Putin and Macron plan to speak again after the French leader meets with Ukrainian President Zelensky. I believe that's today. So they'll be, I think, speaking by phone. What do you think? What do you think Macron could have offered Putin here? Most importantly, to get that kind of a response from him.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure, but Macron does seem to understand the demands that Putin is making, and so maybe they were serious. We maybe have a little bit of an indication, though. Early reports from the Macron-Zelensky call says that Macron says he found concrete solutions, and said that in both meetings with Putin and Zelensky, that leaders are committed to following the Minsk Accords, which is a little bit more interesting coming from the Ukraine side, because recently a high ranking official of Ukraine's national security state said that, we don't want full implementation of the Minsk Accords, which would require giving a lot more autonomy to the separatist Donbas region of Ukraine and allowing them to, I think, be more or less self-governing, which apparently the Ukrainians are somewhat unwilling to do. But getting this commitment from Macron, if maybe getting the same commitment from Putin, would be the first steps in kind of, simmering tensions back down to the levels that we saw in 2015 into 2016 after the Minsk II agreement was in place and the slow burning ceasefire somewhat took effect and somewhat started to work. I mean, people have died in Ukraine over the past 6-7 years since that agreement has been in place, but at the same time, it hasn't been a full out civil war. There hasn't been exchange of territories and the awful things that come along with those kinds of warfare. So a return to that could be like kind of, as Putin said, a basis. I think that's what he called the potential French proposal, as a basis. And so maybe this is the first step towards starting to de-escalate the situation. Now, maybe one of the problems with that, Connor, is does that match the current Russian negotiation strategy, where it seems that they're looking for a bigger deal and have kind of found that the way to get a deal with the Americans is to escalate to the point where they have either to cross a red line or to give you that deal. And so if that's the case, I don't know if Putin would take a small de-escalation step proposed by the French and is maybe looking for like a bigger grand agreement, although even like a pause in the increase in tensions could be significant. Marcone at least said that Putin had agreed to no more military initiatives, and I'm guessing that's a loose term, but probably no more rapid deployed war games. So they're not going to announce that, there's massive war games in March or something like that. That, war games will come with a long warning and everything like that. And that the Russian troops will be leaving Belarus after the war games concluded. And I think the estimated date on that is February 20th. I guess one thing worth mentioning there is that was already the case before. And so while it was kind of, I think, presented particularly by the French as more of concessions, or, more of Putin agreeing to something. Yeah, Putin had already said that. I don't think it was a big shock. However, it being in the context of this being a step for step kind of agreement, this is how international diplomacy works. As Putin says, this could serve as the basis for a bigger agreement, for an emergency security situation in Europe that works. One thing that Marcone has been saying, a word that he's been using that I think is very important, is he's saying he's looking for a historical agreement. And I don't think that he means like in the sense of like history will remember him for the agreement, but a lasting agreement, not something like the Minsk II that just puts a temporary band-aid over the civil war in Ukraine, but a larger agreement with Russia that establishes a secure and lasting security situation on the European continent. Maybe that's too ambitious, but I think it's what needs to happen. And the fact that he's at least talking about it, I think is important. Before we wrap up here, Connor, I do just want to mention there's so much attention being paid to the Russian troop buildup, which I'm not saying is completely insignificant, and the Russian troop war games in Belarus. Again, 30,000 troops there. That's not completely insignificant, and it's not meant to be. Like, the Russians want to, carry out war games that attract Western attention. That's why they're flying bombers and fighter planes over Belarus. That's why they're flying warplanes near British airspace and causing the British to scramble jets. Well, the US does that to Russia all the time, right? I think these are some of the points that Putin are trying to make, but the Western press doesn't cover this, so I think we should. And mention that, as you said, there's German troops going to Lithuania, UK troops going to Poland, and the NATO. This is Estonia, France, and Germany. Germany. Germany isn't involved here. It's the UK, Estonia, and France, and their troops are carrying out the Winter Camp War Games 62 miles in Estonia from the Russian border, Connor. Right on Russia's border, they're carrying out these war games. Hell, I'm pretty sure that these troops are closer to Russia's border than the Russian troops are closer to Ukraine's border. Of course, nobody's talking about the massive buildup in the Baltics on Russia's border or anything like that. We also have massive war games being carried out right now in the Mediterranean Sea. 3 NATO aircraft carrier groups, the USS Truman, which is currently, I believe, still under the integrated NATO command, along with the French Charles de Gaulle and that carrier strike group, and the Italian carrier strike group. And so 3 NATO aircraft carrier strike groups carrying out war games right now in the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, we have talk about the Russian carrying out their war games in the Black Sea, which of course people don't mention is kind of like the Gulf of Mexico a little bit. And the Mediterranean Sea certainly isn't like the Gulf of Mexico. And so, you would think the American war games would be a little bit more concerning than the Russian ones in the Black Sea, but that's not the way it's presented in the American press. We never have American aggression. It's always Russian aggression.
Absolutely. And before we do wrap, I want to talk. Speaking of things that aren't going to get covered in the American press, let's talk about this report in TASS about the potential THAAD, or at least that Ukraine is requesting THAAD missile deployments, missile defense deployments, and radars to. I think it's in Kharkov in Ukraine, which is very close to eastern Ukraine. Or close to the Donbas region, I should say, but it's actually, from the looks of the map, it looks like it's even closer to the Russian border.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is a report. TASS is a Russian government news outlet, right? And this is a Russian source, and so take this with grains of salt. I'm not saying that this is happening. That Ukraine did request from the U.S. To deploy these THAAD mobile anti-ballistic missile defense launchers with radars right next to Russia's border. However, there has been talk over the past several months, Connor, about Russia being concerned about the U.S. deploying strategic weapons in Ukraine. And this was the first report I've actually seen of Russia pointing out how that may be happening. And so I thought it was worth pointing out. This could just be Russia throwing things out there and seeing if there's any truth to it. It's possible that some Ukrainian official said this but really doesn't have any authority, or it's absolutely possible that the Ukrainian government is actually seeking these systems. However, as I point out in that article, that this is a potential pitfall of any diplomacy, a major NATO military escalation in Ukraine, and I think deploying THAAD there would probably achieve that mark, although I think the Patriot missile batteries that the U.S. has in Poland and Romania would be more problematic. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why I gave this a little bit of credibility, is that they were talking about the THAAD systems, which I think maybe Ukraine would see as being some kind of middle ground they could take, where they can't get the Patriot ones, but they could get the THAAD ones, both being air defense systems and everything like that. Of course, the Patriots present more of a problem because the launchers for the Patriot missile interceptors can also be used to launch cruise missiles, which of course could be equipped with nuclear weapons and could be directed at Russia's capital. And so understandable why that's a huge issue. But